Excellent. Now, the title of the class, of course, Worldviews in Christianity. And the point of the class seems to be introducing the concept of worldview, thinking about the core constituents of what might be regarded as a Christian worldview, though not necessarily the Christian worldview. And also learning about other worldviews, and to learn what motivates the thoughts and behavior of people who are not Christians, and to assist us in presenting Christianity persuasively to them and simply understanding what exactly differentiates various non-Christian faiths and ideologies from Christianity and those faiths and ideologies from each other. Now, of course, our only required textbook for the class is James W. Sire's The Universe Next Door, a basic worldview catalog. And in deference to the textbook, right, as we start part one of day one, talking about what worldviews are and why they matter, okay, let's explore Sire's conception of a worldview. And he defines it on page 20 of the textbook. Anyway, considering the importance and complexity of the concept, a remarkably concise definition. A worldview is a commitment to fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, that we hold, consciously or subconsciously, consistently or inconsistently, about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. Now, let's pick apart this definition. All right, the definition, we should know, is controversial from the very start and differs somewhat from the definition Sire uses in prior editions of the book. Notice that he pointedly refuses to conceive of worldview exclusively in terms of what a person thinks. He identifies it as a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. Right, and he writes in the work of being persuaded to conceive of worldview in this way after reading David Naugel's history of the concept of worldview. Yes. And Naugel himself is at least broadly committed to something philosophy associated especially with Herman Dooyeweerd, which one has to give it a name, frequently referred to as the philosophy of the cosmognomic idea, which is a nifty title. Anyway, I need to display the same kind of ingenuity in developing titles for my own views. But the epistemology behind this is quite controversial, because Jowers wants to say, and Sire, I mean, the extent to which he's consciously following Jowers, who knows? But is clearly, when he talks about this idea of the heart, and wants the worldview to be a commitment of fundamental orientation of the heart, certainly Jowers would conceive of the heart as a kind of original center of the person, in which the person orients himself. And he would conceive of the heart as at least logically prior to the distinction between the intellect and the will. There's a certain level at which a person simply, commits himself. And it's not, at least not completely, a matter of inference or deduction or of reasoning, nor is it entirely the province of the will. It's something more original and fundamental of both of those, the core of a person's personality that orients and influences both the intellect and the will. Now, and we're going to see this explains a number of peculiarities about Sire's definition of worldview and his conception of what a Christian worldview might be. But let me point out, at least in a preliminary way, two difficulties. That idea of the heart as being behind everything. And ultimately, the idea that ultimately one doesn't survey the range of options available to one, and on the basis of rational criteria, choose. But this idea that, of course there are significant moments of truth to it, but ultimately what defines us is a commitment of the heart as opposed to a rational decision. Ma'am, it's not. It's explicit that it is more than a rational decision, and it's explicit. He wants to conceive of it as something as logically prior to the rational decision, in which I think all of us, we understand a world, and certainly the will, is a key factor in the act of committing oneself to Christ or adopting any worldview. The question of whether one can say, the intellect, is in some sense supreme over that, the proper arbiter of what should be one's worldview. It's another question entirely, and that's something with which Jowers is uncomfortable. And Sire at least formulates his conception of worldview in such a way as to suggest that he doesn't even desire for people to try to, or rather, he might regard it as idolatrous or fool's errand to try to be thoroughly rational and to subject everything to the reason. And there are two problems inherent in that idea of conceiving of the worldview as a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. Okay, first, there's the specter of subjectivism. That's what Sire seems to want to say, and he's far from the only one who says this, is that ultimately one must he wants to say that, and how should I put this? Because I don't want to imply that every one of our decisions, or certainly the act of faith, is based on comprehensive, mathematically certain evidence. But he wants to say that this orientation of the heart is something that should rule over the intellect, as opposed to vice versa. And I doubt he probably wouldn't phrase things in hierarchical terms like that, but the intellect is not conceived of as the source of the commitment. So there's the concern about subjectivism. If this orientation of the heart, it was prior to the distinction between the intellect and the will, of course, it would be subject to rational evaluation, perhaps change afterwards. But anyway, he seems to be saying that ultimately the decision is based on pre-rational or supra-rational considerations. In which ways it raises the question, is it a leap of faith, or is it, reasonable faith? Yes, faith, but an intelligent, informed faith. The second problem that understanding of worldview raises is the problem, and this is, it's hardly new. The problem comes up in Plato and Aristotle. Yes, in English here. This problem of akrasia, weakness of will. And this is going to be a big issue for Sire's understanding of worldviews, of their contents and consequences throughout the book. Now, akrasia, that's just what happens, for instance, let's say someone knows he's an alcoholic and knows that if he takes a drink, the consequences are likely to be devastating. It's going to enliven these desires, that he might once have managed to conquer, and anyway, the consequences will be terrible if he goes back to the bottle. Nevertheless, there are lots of people who know that full well, and nevertheless take the drink. And so there's a clear contradiction between the person's belief as to what he should do and what he actually does. Now, certainly, Naugel and Sire, they're conscious of that, and they're defining worldview in such a way as to preclude, the idea that the person's actions defining worldview in such a way that the question of whether one's actions are consistent with his worldview either doesn't arise, or at least doesn't arise as easily. And that's a big deal. Not only because it's acrasia, how that can be possible, it's closely related to the conception of, how can a person really deceive himself? If he's deceiving himself, you have to say he actually knows the contrary. But if he knows that, how on earth is he managing to believe and behave otherwise? So Sire is defining worldview in such a way that I can't say, okay, here's my worldview. Here's how I behave. Now, I can't say, wait a minute, my behavior doesn't correspond to my worldview, so I need to adjust my behavior to bring it into line with my worldview. And that certainly, Sire understands the difference between right and wrong and what someone chooses to do, and truth and what someone chooses to believe. But he doesn't want the worldview to be the standard against which one judges the behavior. You can't say that a person's acting inconsistently with his worldview. You can speak of his actions being inconsistent with specific beliefs, but the worldview as Sire conceives of it is, again, the expression of this orientation of the heart. So it's not something of the intellect from which the will can diverge. And anyway, that's different from a lot of conventional definitions of worldview and limits what one can do with the idea. Yes, and ma'am, I'm glad to have you. We'll get to you in just a moment. But Ms. Lynn, you had a question.
So I think to sum up what you said, that the last thing that you stated and where that comes for a bottom line is that the will can diverge from the intellect, but it's not so much that the will diverges from the heart.
Right.
So if this is a heart issue and you act inconsistently, there's no way to say, well, it's in conflict with the will.
Right.
One could say, well, the will is in conflict with the intellect.
Right. At least, you're right, and also one can't use the worldview as a kind of paradigm against. You can't speak of someone behaving inconsistently with his worldview, and which, if we're going to define the worldview that way, then it's going to function very differently than if we defined it as, say, the person's basic beliefs, which may or may not correspond with what the person does. On the one hand, this idea that the worldview, it's an orientation of the heart, somehow logically prior to the distinction between the intellect and the will, and the intellect standing judgment over what one will or will not think or do. Sire's concept of worldview, the worldview would tell you a lot more about a person. But of course, a person can say he believes X, Y, and Z, but that doesn't enable you to peer into his soul as that combined with his behavior does. But on the other hand, it changes the way the whole concept of worldview functions. The idea being, all right, we want to get the right worldview, convince you of what is true. Then let's adjust the behavior so that it corresponds to that. A key aspect of this is that every person has a core orientation of the heart that can't be reduced to a decision made by the intellect and then enacted by the will. And now, understandably, that there are all kinds of influences on human behavior. But he wants to say that ultimately, and I understand, we have these annoying things called emotions, and we are fallen. Or at least others commonly would say, well, the ideal is to do what's reasonable. Try to use your intellect to determine what is true, and then commit your will to it. Whereas Jowers would say that's an illusion. Ultimately, at the core of the person, before it's even differentiated into intellect and will, there's this orientation of the heart. And of course, afterwards, after the thing is made, one can evaluate it rationally and try to change it. But anyway, just the idea that the orientation, it's not a decision made on the basis of evidence. And I said, and I know I need to move on from the review just briefly, that raises two problems. First, it raises the specter of subjectivism. Can I ultimately say to someone who's deeply committed, say, to Buddhism, or to Marxism or something else? And I say to him, here's how you should make decisions. Let's look at reality and evaluate it objectively. Now, and anyway, the concern about what one would not want to tell the person is, well, your commitment is made on the basis of a pre-rational, or at least your beliefs are based on a pre-rational, or at least supra-rational commitment. And I want you to make another commitment that, again, is pre-rational or supra-rational. What one typically wants to do is say, look, here are the facts. Reason, sanity, good sound judgment demands that you believe X instead of Y. And anyway, conceiving of worldview as thinking this way about human decision making makes that a lot more difficult. That doesn't necessarily mean it's false, it's just different from, the conception one frankly commonly sees in the vast majority of Christian apologetics before, say, probably the 18th and 19th centuries. And also it raises this problem or it changes the way in which we must discuss the problem of akrasia. That's what I was talking about a moment ago. The person, he knows he's an alcoholic. He knows taking a drink is likely to have devastating consequences. It's something he ought not to do under any circumstances, but he does it anyway. Okay. If you conceive of worldview in terms of what someone believes, okay, then we have a case where the behavior doesn't correspond to the worldview. And that makes it a lot easier to figure out what the person's worldview is. And also, it raises the possibility that the behavior might conflict with the worldview. Whereas he's saying your worldview, it's not simply what you believe. It's this orientation of the heart that's driving your belief and your behavior. Well, on one hand, if I can know that about a person, that's more informative than knowing just what he believes. But on the other hand, if I'm going to talk about worldview in that way, then it's no longer possible for me to speak of a person's behavior, his way of living, not corresponding with his worldview. Which, again, anyway, it's a different way of thinking. When someone gives a sermon or talks to someone about what the Christian worldview demands, and then says, if you're doing this or that, and look, that's not consistent with your core beliefs, you should do otherwise. One can say that in other words, but with the way Sire is defining worldview, you can't say that your actions are inconsistent with your worldview. Do we see? Yes, Ms. Lind.
What is it about the heart that makes it so that you can't see as clearly that contrast?
Right. Well, it's because, remember, note how he talks about how you find out what a person's worldview is. He says your worldview might not be what you think it is. And it's based on what the person actually does. Well, all of us fail to live up to our noblest ideals. Okay, how we really think we ought to act. And many of us would want to take those ideals to be the worldview and compare that with how we act. Whereas Sire's saying, anyway, you can talk about your actions being inconsistent with your beliefs, but the worldview is something different. He wants to say ultimately it's behind both the belief and the behavior. Of course, is why we also talked about it's raising the problem of subjectivism. If it's something that's ultimately motivating the belief, then how can... And I know nothing is neutral, no one is neutral, but one would hope that one could at least approximate some kind of neutral viewpoint from which to evaluate one's beliefs. And at least the worldview, that's... that becomes very problematic. If you think of if you believe in this whole idea of the heart, it was logically prior to the intellect. Ultimately people just commit themselves. And, I mean, even if people do that, we could argue about whether they ought to do that if we don't think of the person in this way. Okay, that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions. Now, also that can be expressed as a story. That's something new. And I think that's accurate and also speaks to the mentality of many contemporary persons. And I know it's something my wife advises me about my preaching, and a consistent theme is, look, relate it to a story. Most people, they don't think in these abstract categories. And in a story or in a set of presuppositions. And these assumptions, they may be true, partially true, or entirely false. And obviously, many people, they hold to erroneous worldviews. And it's something that people hold consciously or subconsciously first. Now, as you know, it can be terribly difficult to elicit from a fairly unreflective person exactly what his worldview is. What do you think about this? Well, never considered the question. Does it matter? And that kind of thing. But yes, definitely not always conscious. And, even if vaguely conscious, not always explicitly formulated. It's probably the norm for, and especially if one conceives of worldview in the way Sire does, is this fundamental orientation of the heart, is not necessarily being identical with what you believe. Then it's almost by definition largely subconscious. But that's that one, it would not be conscious, or at least not explicitly formulated, would hold on most definitions of worldview, and consistently or inconsistently. I mean, it's sad. This is not something from which Christians are exempt. Many people, even sometimes being aware of it, believe contradictory propositions. And they may attempt to dignify that belief by saying, well, they believe a dialectical truth. And, these are inconsistent on the level of logic, but that somehow reality transcends that. But that's something some people do consciously, and many, many more do unconsciously. And that's especially with the multiplication of knowledge. I mean, in the contemporary world, I know there's, and I agree with Carl Rahner about very little, but, and the quip, we seem to, the world is coming to know more and more about less and less until we reach the ideal point in which we know everything about nothing. And so, yes, especially, I mean, when one thinks about the variety of subjects, at least of which we're aware or can be aware, should be aware, and the data that fall in those different areas, it's going to be hard to find a person, whose overall web of beliefs does not include some inconsistencies. But of course, the worldview would not, again, the way Sire is defining it, would not include all of one's beliefs. It's something of a rule, or a source of other beliefs and behaviors. But still, it's we can argue about how common it is, but there are certainly people who hold dearly beliefs that are patently contradict one another, and usually completely unconscious of that. About the basic constitution of reality. Now that's vague, I suppose it has to be, but I mean, he's right. If it's the worldview, it's about something fundamental. I mean, if we're going to some people use the word, let's distinguish between, and this is not original with me, character named Graham Cole. And he distinguishes between an encyclopedic and an existential worldview. We're talking more about the existential worldview. The basic presuppositions that supply criteria for our thoughts about other things. Whereas I know some people will use the term worldview just to refer to the entire collectivity of a person's beliefs, or the encyclopedic idea. Okay, but at least he's the basic constitution of reality. There's things that logically prior to most of our beliefs and decisions, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. The foundation on which we live and move and have our being, especially that may be a little bit strong. You can have an awfully flimsy worldview and still exist. But he's on to the right idea. The person's, when we ask about a person's worldview, yet whether we want to conceive of it as a commitment, fundamental orientation of the heart, as Sire does, or we want to think of it as in terms of basic beliefs, that lots of other beliefs presuppose. Clearly, it's something that has a tremendous influence on the person's life. Though again, if we want to conceive of it exclusively in terms of belief, we can say that it doesn't have as much influence as it should. I want to say, although if we're going to conceive of regardless of how one conceives of worldview, it has a tremendous influence on a person's broader belief and behavior. And of course, one of the qualms I raised about Sire's idea of worldview, I would personally prefer to conceive of it exclusively in terms of a person's beliefs, so that we can talk about actions that are contrary to the worldview. Now, clearly, when he talks about a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart, one can conceive of actions that run contrary to just about any commitment or fundamental orientation. But he problematizes this when he makes not only the person's beliefs, but his behavior a key to figuring out what the worldview is. Because if the worldview is what's expressed by the totality of beliefs and behaviors, you can't go back and say that the worldview is inconsistent with that behavior. And because the behavior is helping define what the worldview is. And that's maybe a good idea, may not, but it's something of which we should be conscious, and which influences how Sire talks about the idea of worldview. Yes.
Is this the right way to rephrase what you just said?
Go ahead.
To use his definition of worldview,
Yeah.
means that you can't look at the behavior as manifesting the worldview?
Well, no,
The same way that you could if it were...
he wants to say that the behavior manifests the worldview. But the difference with him, he wants to say that all of your behavior manifests your worldview. Whereas, and perhaps all of it, in some aspect of every individual act of a person would manifest the person's worldview. But he would want to say that just about everything. Whereas, at least I would be more comfortable with talking about a worldview as a set of basic beliefs which a person's actions can contradict. But to do that, I can't use the actions as a guide to what the person's worldview is.
Because it might or might not be consistent.
Right, exactly. And of course, obviously I'm going to use actions if I'm trying to figure out what someone else's worldview is, because of course people lie and about what they believe. And still, one's actions can conflict with one's beliefs. And there's just the question of on what side of the divide do you want to put the worldview? And that goes back to the ultimate problem about subjectivism. Because if the worldview is just a matter of belief, it's a matter which one is rationally evaluating and which one can change on the basis of rational or one it's something about which rational considerations alone can justify a change. Of course, you can't really change your worldview without a change in the heart, behavior that, especially in becoming a Christian, not possible without divine grace. But at least one can say that the person ought to do so because of rational considerations alone, which doesn't seem possible given Sire's definition. Okay, so moving right along. Questions a worldview answers according to Sire. Now again, and of course, Sire's capable of being wrong. I'm capable of being wrong. Please, disagree or express disagreement, questions, and that's because I say something, that doesn't mean it's so. What is prime reality? The really real. And I don't know if I especially like that way of putting things. I know what he's getting at with just about every worldview. I mean, let's say a materialist. He thinks there's nothing but matter. Matter would be the really real. But I would want to say, and again, this is a disagreement between Jowers and me. Jowers wants to say that whatever one's worldview, there's something conceived of as the ultimate, that's regulative for everything else, from which everything else flows. And I'm not sure that's true. As especially because I'm thinking about, we have nowadays these people who like to speak of themselves as non-foundationalist. The foundationalist way of thinking is that ultimately what I know, what I believe, at least should be grounded in reality. You can draw, it may not be a straight line, but it will be a line, from what I perceive with my senses, and when I work out with my reasoning from that to what I actually believe, at least ideally, and that I can test my beliefs over against some foundation. Yes, go ahead.
Correspondence theory of truth?
Yeah, correspondence theory of truth, yes, is for traditional foundationalism. You're saying this reality should be the foundation of your beliefs. Whereas there are lots of people who would want to say, well, we don't need a foundation of our beliefs. They would say that the totality of one's beliefs about the world, that they're not like a they say we shouldn't even think that they should be like a skyscraper where you start at a foundation and build up, 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 up. It's more like a wigwam, where you can't say that any one stick in the thing is the foundation of the whole. And they would say, yes, beliefs are motivated by other beliefs, but there is nothing outside of the beliefs that would motivate the whole. And that's just, that's a matter of epistemology, talking about how and what people can know. But think about on the level of ontology, again, the materialist. There are lots of materialists who would say that, yes, every individual part of the universe requires a cause, but who would not want to say that there has to be one cause for everything. And there's a sense in which that person believes in a prime reality and that he thinks everything is matter. But he doesn't think that there's a kind of reality from which everything else is derivative. And what is the nature of external reality, the world around us? That's pretty straightforward. Of course, one has to think about how, the next question, what is a human being? Of course, the world around us, we're part of it. And some of the more controversial issues he includes in his, it's basically another way of defining a worldview, questions it should answer. What happens to a person at death? Certainly there are people with some worldviews who would say that that's not a question. Just because my worldview doesn't answer that question, that doesn't mean my worldview is somehow inadequate, as if you accept the other presuppositions on which that are the basis of my thought, that's unknowable. And clearly it's critical if one professes to hold to a Christian worldview. Why is it possible to know anything at all? And that's an important question for everyone. I don't know if I would want to say it's a question every worldview must answer. Just think about one of the worldviews we plan to look at is nihilism. You say everything's crazy. None of my beliefs is justified. And he just doesn't know anything. And how do we know what is right and wrong? I mean, again, I'm going to be, these questions for Sire's worldview later. Some worldviews will answer that question, others won't. And if your worldview is such that you think morality is an illusion. And what is the meaning of human history? And again, what personal, life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? And not just nihilism. What personal, life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? One can imagine a variety of worldviews would say, well, that's something you choose, more or less arbitrarily. I make myself what I want to be. And there's nothing about the way reality is that dictates what that should be. I'm thinking of, this is part of of course, one of the great problems of our time, people no longer perceive as clearly as they once did and say that homosexual behavior is wrong. Part of the reason for that is that if you don't believe in a creator who created human beings with certain intentions, then how people are put together, it would be utterly irrelevant to your question of what they should do. Whereas we would say, wait a minute, this is unnatural. God made people to do otherwise. And they would admit that, that people are structured to do otherwise is painfully obvious. But if it's just a matter of chance that things turned out that way, who cares? And now questions for Sire's concept of worldview. How can one distinguish between beliefs that do and beliefs that do not belong to one's worldview? And that would be a big question for just about any conception of worldview. Where does one draw the line, if the line can be drawn? And let me say, there are various ways of, it's difficult to determine that on Sire's concept of worldview. But in fairness to Sire, it would be difficult to determine that on just about any conception of worldview. But I do want to say we shouldn't there are a variety of ways of referring to this fallacy. People talk about maybe a more contemporary one. You've maybe heard of Loki's wager, right? Loki, this Norse trickster god, he makes a deal with some trolls that, if they do something, which he doesn't think they'll do, then they have the right to cut off his head. Okay, the trolls accomplish it. So they come back to Loki. All right, Loki, now's the time to cut off your head. And Loki says, you have the right to cut off my head, but you don't have the right to cut off any portion of my neck. Well, so the trolls, immediately an argument breaks out. Where does the guy's neck end and his head begin? And of course, ultimately, they never cut off Loki's head because they can't figure out where the neck stops and where the head starts. But the fallacy, just because one can't precisely demarcate that difference, that doesn't mean there's no difference between the head and the neck. Okay, so I want to say, admittedly, it's a problem for Sire, it's a problem for just about any worldview. Okay, that it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to discriminate precisely between beliefs that do and do not belong to it. And I think we can admit that without denying that there is a difference. I mean, there's a big difference between beliefs that are the foundations for a lot of other beliefs, that help define one's life and one's outlook on the world, and your belief, about, what a chewing gum, how large a chewing gum wrapper is. I think pretty safely say that would not fall within the worldview. Okay, also, discounting a person's life-orienting core commitments as elements of his worldview help or hinder in determining what a person actually believes. And, we've talked about this. As again, also, and I know, Miss Gordon, you spoke about, concerns with evangelism. When you're talking to someone, do you want to know what that core commitment is, or do you want to know what the person believes? So the person's actions, frequently people's actions are radically inconsistent with what they believe. And there are some worldviews where they're unlivable. If you were a nihilist, if you really didn't believe anything, you wouldn't be capable of doing a lot of the things you have to do to sustain your own existence. Okay, so, and again, it's a matter of defining worldview, but if you want to say, hey, your worldview is implausible, you need to adopt this alternative worldview. Again, it helps, at least if you want to talk about in worldviews in that way, if you think of worldview exclusively in terms of belief. And we've talked about acrasia and what Graham Cole calls the Socratic fallacy. You could see, you read Plato's Apology, his account of Socrates' defense of himself before the Athenian court that convicted him of corrupting the youth, and an underlying supposition of Socrates and later Plato himself seems to be that a person really can't do something he believes is wrong. If a person is doing something wrong, there must be something wrong about the way the person thinks. And if you could just educate the person well enough so that he knew that it was wrong, the disordered behavior would disappear. Now, of course, Aristotle thinks otherwise. He thinks ocracy is possible. People do know X is wrong and go ahead and do X anyway. But again, if we want to say that ocracy is possible, that you can act in a way that belies your beliefs, then there's going to be almost inevitably a gulf between the core commitments and what the person believes. And in conceiving of worldviews this way, bringing in factors other it means a different way of talking, and makes the way one uses the concept of worldview in evangelism and other contexts quite different. And to what extent can the cogency and existential adequacy of different worldviews' answers to these questions constitute neutral criteria for the evaluation of various worldviews? And again, we've touched on that. If you're a materialist or a nihilist or an existentialist, and that you don't know what will happen after death, big deal. Yeah, if I were a Christian, I would think that's a tragedy. It's something I need to know. But my worldview is such that, the answer to that question is not something I need to know. So I think Sire's worldview questions, and again, going into 4, must every worldview answer all of these questions? Well, by the criteria of those worldviews, no. Okay, given that, Sire's questions, they're not at all useless. Okay, it does a pretty good job of outlining what the questions a Christian worldview answers and must answer. And also these questions, again, you deal with a person could legitimately say, my worldview, by its own criteria, doesn't need to answer those questions. Still, they can be tremendously useful as heuristic stimuli that help elicit persons' worldviews. If someone doesn't know what his worldview is, or maybe he does know, but you're trying to figure out from something he's written or said what that worldview is, asking these questions and seeing how the person answers those questions really helps a lot in figuring out what the person's worldview is. And also, those questions help a great deal in framing discussions about matters of worldview in such a way as to facilitate the presentation of Christianity as a reasonable option. That is, say you're dealing with someone who doesn't necessarily know what his worldview is, and perhaps doesn't necessarily care, and you're just exploring the idea. And you talk about, well, these are some of the things, a lot of worldviews answer. And if you pose some of these questions, what happens to you when you die? How do you know what is right and wrong? How can we know that we know anything at all? Christianity has much better answers to those questions than many other worldviews. It might not be the fairest way of stacking the deck, but certainly, mean, useful in terms of practical conversation, which is one of the main things Sire has in mind.